serve. Amen. Well, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to follow that introduction at all, but I'll do my best. Well, good evening, everybody. Like Tom said, my name is Chris Kindle. If you get confused, you just think Chris Kringle. You know, we're getting into the colder seasons, and so that's just an easier way to remember that. And I do get that quite a bit when I travel, and every time somebody asks me that, like, oh, Chris Kringle. And they always think they're the first person to have told me that, you know. It's something I grew up with. As Tom said, I am a pastor. I've been a pastor now for a little over 22 years. I've served 3 local congregations. 2 of them were up in Kane District. My first church was Good Shepherd, which was a merger of 7 churches, or I should say 6 churches. One of the churches went with a different place, and so 3 of the churches formed Good Shepherd, and I was the second full-time pastor there of that church. My second appointment was at Concord. I was an associate pastor at Concord, and some of you probably know the guy who followed me there, Tom Kennedy, followed me at Concord when I moved on to St. Mary's. And Tom was a dear friend of mine. He was a member. We were in a covenant group together, and had lunch today actually with another one of our covenant group guys, and we were talking about Tom and his kids and all that. So dear friend, and miss him dearly. Most recently, I went on conference center staff as the coordinator for discipleship and spiritual formation, and so I travel around Western Pennsylvania, and I talk about intentional discipleship planning and lead retreats, things like that. And then God in His mercy brought me back to the local church in 2019, and I went back to Concord and am serving there as one of the preaching pastors. The first time I was at Concord, we had this great idea to start a second 11 o'clock service. And so we had our sanctuary, which had a wonderful traditional service going on. We had this big room on the other side of the building that wasn't being used. And so we had a Saturday evening contemporary worship that we had moved to that big space, and then we thought, well, what happens if we do this on Sunday morning and if we did it at the same time? So kind of difficult for one pastor to do, so it necessitates having 2 of us. And so I get to preach every week at that church and do some Bible study and discipleship there. And so I'm very happy, very blessed. And your pastor, Chris Livermore, and my senior pastor, John Phipps, are good friends as well. So our pastors tend to know each other, and we all run in the same pack, so it's great. You know, just a couple words about our training here tonight. I really want it to be your training, and so if at any time you have a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, stop me. I'm a pastor at heart, and so like all pastors, we think we get paid by the word, and so I will talk and talk and talk until someone stops me. And so don't hesitate to ask a question, right? There are no stupid questions. Secondly, just recognizing that as we talk about abuse, just knowing the statistics that there's a chance that somebody here might have been a victim of abuse at one time or another. And so simply us talking about it can bring up some bad memories. And so if at any time you need to get up and stretch your legs and just kind of remove yourself from the situation, please don't hesitate to do that. And I would encourage you to talk to one of your pastors. And remember, abuse is not our fault, right? It's not something that we did. And so just want to make that, put that out there as well. And I know, so Tom's already prayed, and so we'll just go ahead and get started. We'll go to the first slide. So the reason why we're here tonight is that we're here to protect children, youth, and vulnerable adults, right? That is the big purpose. That's the why statement of why we do Safe Sanctuaries. But we're also here to protect volunteers. So all of you kind of fall into that category. You are serving, you are helping young people, whether they're children or youth. You are helping, And so Safe Sanctuaries is as much for you as it is the people you're serving. And we're also here to protect the ministry. We're here to protect Latrobe United Methodist Church's reputation. How long has Latrobe been a church in this area? Like, how old's the church? Over 175 years in the area. Yeah. So so that's a long stretch of ministry, and there's a wonderful reputation that this church has, and God's reputation, and we want to protect that as well. So we'll go to the next slide. So every church then is responsible to have a safe sanctuary policy, right? And it's I didn't travel tonight up from Cranberry Township with a policy that says this is the way that you have to do it, right? Because it wouldn't be conceivable for 800 churches to be able to fall under one safe sanctuary guidelines, right? So every church is responsible to create their own guideline. There are helps and there are helpers that can help with that process, but it's the church's responsibility to have that piece of paper in hand. And so what that policy is doing, it's protecting them from bodily harm, from emotional damage, and from spiritual destruction. Now let me explain what I mean by that. So I think there's a handful of ways that we can view or that we can understand safe sanctuaries, kind of like the lens through which we view it. And so one of the lenses that we can view safe sanctuaries is, what's in it for us. And so one of the things people will say is that if we have a good safe sanctuary program, we're more likely to get families with young children, right? Because there's not a church on the face of the earth that does not want families with young kids, right? That is a desirable demographic. Even my parents' church, right? My parents' church is about 20 people, and they're all 70 and up. And my mom still continues to say, we need kids, and like, that's not the church you are right now. Your church is geared for senior citizens, and, live into that truth. But there is some truth to that, right? That having a good safe sanctuary program is attractive to families, to parents. My daughter isn't so young anymore. She's 16, learning to drive. Please pray for me. My hair I just started to turn gray, and I think it's largely because of Sophia learning how to drive. But early on, when I started doing this work about 10 years ago, one of the ways that I evaluated every church was by how they treated my daughter, Sophia. And most of the churches we went to, I would have no problem taking her back to, right? They treated her well. They protected her. There were a handful of churches, though, that I would never take my daughter back to, right? Because they didn't treat my treasure well, right? I didn't think they took seriously her care and her protection. And so while there is some truth to that if we have a good safe sanctuary program, and as our community learns about that, it is attractive to families, that's not the reason why we do safe sanctuaries. Another one of the reasons, one of the lenses that we can look at it is that if you do not have a policy in hand and something happens, right, a case of abuse happens within the church, your insurance policy does not have to protect you. And so here we have a church that might be 185 years old, and because something happens and we don't have a policy, everything could be wiped out, right? Because there are very few churches that could handle the 5-figure, 6-figure, 7-figure amount that an abuse case might yield. It's important, but that's not the reason why we do safe sanctuaries. I think another one of the reasons why we do safe sanctuaries is, I already told you that I served 3 local churches in my time in ministry, and I've been able to label each one of my churches with a single word. And I think our communities do the exact same thing, right? That's the church that has those great spaghetti dinners. That's the church that if you visit, people actually talk to you. That's the church, if you visit, they bring you a warm plate of cookies. That's the church where the abuse happened. And so the mission statement of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And that kind of label, that kind of reputation, the church where the abuse happened is going to significantly hinder you from doing what your church exists to do. Now that one comes pretty close, I think, in my eyes, as to the big why. Why do we do safe sanctuaries? But I think the big reason why we do it is a theological reason, right? And we're theology. We can go that direction, right? We're people of the book. And so let's take the worst possible case happens, right? A child is a victim of abuse within the house of God. And because that happens in the house of God, a child connects that pain of abuse with Jesus and holds Jesus at an arm's length their entire life. And so they walk 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, and they're holding Jesus at an arm's length the entire time, right? So just in the short term, they've missed out on the joy and the hope and the peace and the purpose, the love of having a relationship with Jesus and a connection with the church. And that's just in the short term, right? Because we are a theological people, so we can think with an eternal perspective. So we carry that out even further. So a child who's a victim of abuse within the house of God connects the pain of abuse with Jesus, holds Jesus at an arm's length. They're 50, 60, 70, 80 years, 90 years, however many years they have here on earth. And then they enter into eternity without a relationship with Jesus. Right? And so the church will have participated in the destruction of a soul, which is the exact opposite reason why we are here. Right? We are here to connect people with Jesus. We're here to share that love and that truth. And so that is the big reason why we talk about safe sanctuaries. That is why we're here tonight, so that we make sure that no child would ever connect the pain of abuse with Jesus and not make that relationship with Jesus their own. So we'll go to the next slide. And so again, just to reiterate, right, so it is Latrobe. Is it Latrobe or Latrobe? So Latrobe. My wife is from Blairsville, and she and I had this conversation last night. I'm like, is it Latrobe or Latrobe? And she says Latrobe. No, Latrobe. I shouldn't have opened that can of worms. My apologies. Yeah, so it is this church's responsibility to have that policy. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So talk about the reason why we're here, why we're doing this. And so, obviously there's a biblical mandate to be doing what we're talking about. And obviously, when you look through the Old Testament, there's this common refrain in the Old Testament that the people of God are to stand up and care for the widow and the orphan and the alien. Right? It is a command by God to stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. Right? To give voice to those who do not have a voice. And so to me, that's just, is a beautiful illustration coming out of the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, I have struggled for years with this understanding of safe sanctuaries, because to me, the church should be like this. Right? Arms open wide, welcoming the world. Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Whereas when we talk about safe sanctuaries, it's a little bit like giving the stiff arm. Right, where we hold people back, stranger danger, scary, I don't know you. And so to me, being a visual person, it's hard to rectify this with this. And then a number of years ago, I was at a friend of mine, his father had passed away, and this passage from John 10 was being shared, and then it was talking about Jesus being the gate. And it was like all of a sudden, it all just clicked. Right, because we, as imitators of Christ, get to do what Jesus did. And what does a gate do? So when Jesus is saying, I am the gate, right? So he is standing there. He is welcoming the world, welcoming all to come into a relationship. But the vulnerable, right, his sheep are behind him. And so if you want to get to the most vulnerable, you've got to get through the gate. You've got to get through Jesus. And so for us as the church, we get to do the exact same thing. We get to welcome the world in. We get to welcome our community in, knowing that in order to get to the vulnerable, you've got to get through us first. So I think that's the biblical mandate. And then there's a conference mandate. So I don't know how much of you are kind of general conference followers, but in 1996, a miracle happened. And that miracle was that they agreed on something at General Conference. Yes, a unicorn was sighted that night. But anyway, so what happened at the General Conference of 1996 was that all of us agreed that what it means to be a United Methodist is that we would be very serious about the care and protection of children, youth, and vulnerable adults. That this is part of what it means to be a United Methodist. And our church has been in the forefront of this for many years. Now, when I first got my job in 2013, I remember going down to a training in Pittsburgh, and the Pennsylvania law was changing 13, 14, 15 quite a bit. And so some of the law changes, I was there was one other United Methodist pastor, and I remember looking at her and I said, like, gosh, we're already doing all of this. And the presenter said, yes, the United Methodist Church has been out in front of this for a long time. And so it's something that we can take pride in as a church, that this is meaningful to us as United Methodists. Thirdly, open hearts, open doors. That was an old tagline from years ago: open minds, open hearts, open doors. And I put that there as a placeholder to simply talk about the fact that, that is the church, right? I've traveled to hundreds of churches, and I have not yet walked into a church where there was a list of sins that said, if you have committed one of these, that you were not allowed in, right? I've not come across that yet, and I'm very thankful for that. Now, that being said, so it is 2022, and there are people in your community that are on the Megan's Law website, right? There are registered sex offenders. If you haven't done so in a while, I would encourage you to Google Pennsylvania Megan's Law. You can type in the church's address. You can type your church or your home address then even, and see within a geographical region how many registered sex offenders are there. And I'm not saying that so that then you put their pictures on the door so that they do not come in, right? Because the church is a place where broken and sinful people come to be made right with a loving and holy God, right? We make disciples. We welcome sin in, right? If we didn't welcome sinners in, you wouldn't have any pastors to preach. There wouldn't be anybody to fill the pews, right? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But that being said, that means we have to be doing our job very well, right? We have to be on our A game if we are going to take our role in our world seriously and having our doors open to anybody who might come in. And then lastly, all of the Pennsylvania laws, which really aren't new anymore. I just need to change my PowerPoint to just say Pennsylvania laws, but we'll talk more about those as they go on. So next slide. So statistically, there are 3 million reported cases of child abuse every year. It breaks down to about 8,219 a day, 342 per hour. That's more than 8 every minute, more than 1 every 15 seconds. And so you think about, if we're here for 2 hours tonight talking about how we prevent abuse, there will be 684 reported cases of child abuse, just in the time that we're here talking about how we prevent it. Now, the scary thing about that slide is that word reported, right? So my undergraduate degree was in criminology, and so when I read that slide, what I read is that there may be 3 million reported cases, but more than likely, there are at least 6 million, if not more, actual cases of abuse. Because this would be a very underreported type of a crime. And so, reported and actual statistics vary by a lot. And so you double every one of those, and that's probably the actual figures, and that's a conservative guess. We'll go to the next slide. So additionally, by the age of 18, 1 in every 3 girls and 1 in every 6 boys, or 5 boys, depending upon the study that you're reading, is sexually abused. So oftentimes, I know I've been here at least once, if not twice before. One of the things I'll tell churches, who are having a difficulty believing that it's important for us to be talking about safe sanctuaries, that I tell them simply on Sunday, they just start doing the math and counting 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you begin to see the pervasive nature of the evil that exists in our world. Right? Abuse is not located just in small towns or just in large towns. It's not white, it's not black, it is everything. Like abuse is just across the board, and it's something that we have to take seriously. So we'll go to the next slide. Definitionally, children are birthed through about 6th grade, youth are 7th through 12th grade. That is what all of the Pennsylvania laws deal with, are everybody from birth through 12th grade, or about 18 years of age. And a lot of the Pennsylvania law will simply say children, and so sometimes I will simply say children. But if you hear me saying that, hear me saying 18 years of age and younger. And so vulnerable adults then fall into 2 different categories, and we'll go to the next slide. So vulnerable adults are, could be some of our senior adults. It could be folks who are mentally or physically disabled, could fall into that category. But Safe Sanctuary also understands that everybody who works with children or youth would be considered a vulnerable adult, right? Because all of you are serving, believing your church is doing everything it can to protect you, right? And so a phrase that I will say probably more than once tonight: an accusation does not need to be true to ruin a life. Safe Sanctuaries is as much for you, the volunteer, as it is for the children you are serving. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk about some of the red flags. We're going to go through the definitions of abuse, the different types of abuse, and some of the characteristics that we might see. So the first one is physical abuse, and physical abuse is defined as abuse in which a person deliberately and intentionally causes bodily harm to a child. Right? It could be striking with a fist, with an open hand, shaking, choking, hitting with a belt, extinguishing cigarettes on a body, things like that. All those things fall under this category of physical abuse. Next slide. Some of the red flags, some of the markers that you might see: hostile or aggressive behavior towards others, fearfulness of parents or other adults, destructive behavior towards self, others, or property, burns, facial injuries, patterns of repetitious bruises could all be a sign or a symptom of physical abuse. There's always that old standard example that I remember learning as I was leaving seminary and coming back to Pennsylvania, but it's the heat of a Pennsylvania summer, right? You're doing vacation Bible school, and you've got that one young guy who comes up, and he's wearing long pants and a long sleeve shirt, and it's like 85 degrees, 200% humidity, and it's just crazy hot out, and he won't roll up his sleeves or anything like that. Because if he does, he's afraid you might see the marks. You might see the bruises or the burns. Right? God, give us the eyes to see. If there's something going on in front of us, give us the eyes to see so that we can stand in front of it. So we'll go to the next slide. Next slide is emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, or serious mental abuse is what it's termed in Pennsylvania, is abuse in which a person exposes a child to spoken and/or unspoken violence or emotional cruelty. It's this conveying a sense of being unloved or unlovable. Emotional abuse is very damaging, but it's incredibly difficult to prove. I was doing this training one time up in Grove City with the Mercer County Children and Youth Services, and the woman I was teaching with had been there for 17 years, and in 17 years she had only ever seen 2 cases of emotional abuse go to trial. And it happens a lot more than that. It's very difficult to prove. And I've often wondered as a pastor, some of the things I see in adults, if what they stem from isn't emotional abuse as a child. Emotional or physical abuse will leave a scar that might disappear with age, but emotional abuse, it like damages our DNA. It changes who we are. And so we'll go to the next slide. So some of the red flags that we might see is severe depression or withdrawal, exhibiting severe lack of self-esteem, failure to thrive, speech or eating disorders, going to extremes to seek parental approval, or extreme passive-aggressive behavior could all be, a sign or a symptom of emotional abuse. We're not talking like normal teenager stuff, right? Like the teenager, you get the funks and, kind of the highs and lows. This is when a normally happy-go-lucky child, you see this long slide, this long change. And again, God, give me the eyes to see if there's something for me to see. So we'll go to the next one. The next one, neglect, or again, as Pennsylvania would define it as serious physical neglect, is abuse in which a person endangers a child's health, safety, or welfare through negligence. So this could be a lack of dental care, lack of medical care, lack of food, lack of proper clothing for the season, a lack of hygiene, even love and affection can sometimes fall under this rubric of neglect. And so we'll go to the next slide. So some things for us to see. Now this is the largest category that CYS has to deal with. Neglect is the biggest category that they work with. Things like failure to thrive, pattern of inappropriate dress for climate, begging or stealing for food, chronic hunger. Right? God made teenage boys with empty legs, and they just eat and they never seem to be satisfied. But the friends of mine some friends of mine that I have that are a part of the foster care world will share with me these cases or stories of hoarding food. Like I don't think I've ever been really hungry. Right? I may think I'm hungry. I may be like, oh, I'm really hungry. Like, my next meal is never very far away. I'm pretty well taken care of that way. But there are kids who have existed in a world where they don't know. It could be a day, it could be a couple days. And so they will hoard food. My friend said, like you go into a bedroom and you will smell spoiled and rotten food. And it's not because these kids are bad or they're not thinking. It's just they have been scared out of their mind with hunger before. God, give me the eyes to see. Give us the eyes to see. Depression, untreated medical conditions, or poor hygiene. All could be another, red flag, just kind of waving. Would you see what's going on? Would you help me? So let's go to the next slide. So we've talked about physical, we've talked about emotional, we've talked about neglect. And so our next one is sexual abuse. And so sexual abuse is defined as abuse in which sexual contact between a child and an adult or a more powerful youth occurs. Right? Because a child is never, ever able to give consent. And this, just isn't intercourse. This could be incest. It could be fondling. It could be exposure to or exploitation with pornography. There's just a lot of horrible things that could fall under this category of abuse. And so we'll go to the next slide. So some red flags, unusual advanced sexual knowledge or behavior, depression, crying for no apparent reason, promiscuous behavior, difficulty walking or sitting, bruised or bleeding in the vaginal or anal areas, exhibiting frequent headaches, stomach aches, or extreme fatigue, even sexually transmitted diseases. Could all be a sign, a symptom, maybe a little hand hoping that somebody would see and step in front of. I'll go to the next one. So some of the ones, I think that are really important for us to hear at church about this. Unusual nervousness or anxiety at being left alone in a nursery or Sunday school class. Reluctance to participate in church activities once enthusiastically approached. Right? Maybe Susie just had a fight with a friend and doesn't want to go to youth group, or maybe it's something worse. Comments such as, I don't want to be left alone with so-and-so. Like, never, ever let that phrase be uttered without you really hearing it. They are telling you something, and so pay attention. Nightmares or hostility towards child care worker or teacher could all be a sign, just a red flag of sexual abuse. Okay, next. So those four, physical, emotional, neglect, and sexual, those are all in the Pennsylvania Crime Code. Ritual abuse does not exist in our Pennsylvania crime statutes. Here, I'll tell you what it is. So ritual abuse is abuse in which physical, sexual, psychological violations of a child are inflicted in a stylized way by a person responsible for the child's welfare. So a case of ritualistic abuse in Pennsylvania would simply be broken up into physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. But Joy Melton, who is the one who created Safe Sanctuaries, beyond being a pastor, is also a lawyer. And so she has added this because, as people of the book, we recognize that our battle isn't just against flesh and blood, that there is a spiritual realm out there. And so we need to recognize that. So we'll go, before we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a story to help kind of give you a glimpse of what this is about. So as Joy has been in Western Pennsylvania a number of times, and I've heard her speak a number of times, she has shared a story, a true story, unfortunately, about a church someplace down south. She's never identified the church. She just simply talks about it as something to help illustrate ritualistic abuse. And so in this particular church, the church had a children's church that took place in the basement of the church. And so Sunday morning, mom and dad would bring little Johnny, little Susie, and drop them off downstairs for children's church, and they would come upstairs for adult church, right? And it's a wonderful thing. They get to sing their songs and hear about, stories on their level, and get them geared up for worship. It can be a great, great opportunity. What had happened in this particular church, though, was that there was a group of Satanists that had infiltrated the children's ministry to a point where they kind of completely owned it. And so what was actually happening on Sunday mornings as mom, dad, grandma, grandpa are dropping off kids is that they were being taken to a third-party spot nearby the church. So they're being taken off church property, going to another property next door. There were satanic rituals being performed on these with using the children, and a sexual component to it as well. And they told the kids, if you say anything, we'll kill your mom and your dad. And so this went on for 2 years. Hey, imagine, you're coming to church and you're singing and you're worshiping, you're thinking, I'm such a good parent. My kids are in children's church. They're learning what they need to learn. And all the while, what they're experiencing is the exact opposite. And so one day, a brave little girl came running out, run, mommy, daddy, run, they're going to kill you, they're going to kill you. And it all began to unravel. Earlier I had said that, our communities label our churches. Can you imagine the label that church must have had? Like, that's the church where that happened. And since Joy's never identified the church, I don't know if the church still exists or not. I can't imagine it would. I really can't. Only by the grace of God would you be able to get through something like that. So I guess the key is don't get into a situation like that. So let's talk about some of the red flags on the next slide. So disruptions of memory or consciousness, unexplained mistrust or mood swings, flashbacks, eating disorders, fear of the dark, especially at sundown or full moon, fear of ministers, priests, or others wearing robes or uniforms could all be a sign or a red flag of of something, not good happening. Okay, any questions so far on anything that we've talked about? So I'm either doing a really good job or you guys just want to get out early so you can watch the football game later, right? It's not the Steelers this week, right? We chose well. It's not the Steelers. Okay. Now the good news is we're done with the ick part of our time together. And so now we get to talk about how do we go about creating a safe sanctuary. And so, what are the building blocks? What are those essential pieces to having a safe sanctuary? And so we can go ahead 2 slides there. So kind of the first foundational piece of having a safe sanctuary is that you have at least 2 adults in every classroom who aren't related or cohabitating. No child is to be left alone with one adult. It's best if these 2 children are not related. So before we go any further, I want to say, hopefully you remember me telling you at the very beginning of our time that I didn't come from Cranberry Township with a policy that says this is the way that you have to do it, right? You remember me saying that? Because your church has to, craft and create your own policy. And I say that to you at this point because this is one of the best practices that gets altered the most. And so what a lot of churches will do is that they will say, we'll have at least 2 adults in every classroom, and they'll put a period there. And they'll take out, who aren't related or who are cohabitating. And they do that because, volunteers can be very difficult to come by, right? Mr. and Mrs. Smith got married because they like each other, and so they probably want to teach Sunday school class together. I get that. But the problem is that anytime you mess with the best practices, you always increase risk. There's always a trade-off. And so in this particular situation, so say I'm teaching Sunday school class with my wife, Jan, and someone makes an accusation against me. Well, Jan and I were married, and we have a child together. Our income is commingled, right? We share a last name. If something happens to me, I happen to be the major breadwinner of our family. If something happens to me, it's really going to affect my family. But, ma'am, what's your name? Lisa. So, Lisa, if you and I were teaching a Sunday school class and an accusation was made against me, would you feel bad for me? Sure. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's good. Yeah. Even in this hypothetical illustration, I have not done anything bad. But Lisa and I aren't married. We don't share a bank account. We don't have a child together. We don't have the same last name. So Lisa is not really going to be affected if I get accused of a wrongdoing. And the law is going to look at Lisa's testimony far differently than they're going to look at my wife's testimony. And so as an adult volunteer, it is far safer for me to teach Sunday school class with Lisa than it is with my own wife. Do you guys understand that? Does that make sense? Now, there aren't many churches that do this to this level, right? Because it is a very high bar to have 2 unrelated adults in every classroom. The church I am currently serving, we have put a period after the classroom because we recognize that it is a very difficult and high bar to get. The thing is, your policy, whatever you have in your policy is what you have to do, not what you want to do. And so this sounds great, right? I mean, if you're going to be writing an ideal policy, this sounds wonderful, right? This sounds like we really are doing a bang-up job with our safe sanctuaries. But if we can't do this every week, then it can't be in our policy. All right, our policy is what we are going to be doing, not what we want to do or hope to do. Because if something would ever happen at church, the first thing a lawyer is going to do is say, can I see your safe sanctuary policy? If you don't have a safe sanctuary policy, you're sunk. If you do have a safe sanctuary policy, and you're not following what you say you do, you're equally as sunk. And so your policy has to say what you can do, what you're going to be doing, what you will always be doing. And so this is the one that gets changed the most because it is a very, very high bar. And so we'll go to the next slide. So that's, so best practice, 2 adults, 2 unrelated adults in every classroom. Next best thing, 2 adults in every classroom. If you can't do 2 adults in every classroom, then, then we have to get a little bit more creative. And so let's just say if this was a big hall, right, you could have some flexible walls and very easily create a couple classrooms in a space like this. And you could have a single adult in each one of those classrooms. It would be very open, very visible, and also very safe. You could even notch it up a little bit and have somebody just kind of walking around the perimeter. Next thing, if you can't do that, then you maybe have an open door policy, and I grew up with a Sunday school superintendent at the church I grew up with, who would collect the offering, collect the attendance, and then would disappear for the rest of Sunday school. You can't do that. You would maybe have a full-time floater who would walk around the building, just making sure all the classrooms were safe. So we just, if you can't do this, you got to do this. And if you can't do this, then you got to do this. If you can't do this, you got to do this. We figure out what we can do on a weekly basis, and then we do it. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is where Pennsylvania law begins to impact us in church world. So Pennsylvania law, beginning January 1st of 2015, it says that all volunteers must have, working with children, need to have the 33, which is the Pennsylvania Child Abuse Clearance, and the Act 34, which is the Pennsylvania State Police Criminal Background Check. Right, so those are things that we have to have, all of us have to have. Right, it used to be, right, when I first became a pastor, well, if we have one person in the room that has clearances, we're good. Or just the main teacher, not the helper, needs to have the clearances. And Pennsylvania's cleared it all up for us. Everybody working with children, and again, when Pennsylvania says that, you've got to hear anybody under the age of 18, anybody working with children must have, it's the law, the 33 and 34 clearances. And then the next slide talks about if you have not been a Pennsylvania resident for at least 10 consecutive years, then you will also need to have the FBI record check. Okay? So you have 33, 34, and if you have not been a Pennsylvania resident for at least 10 years, you need the FBI record check. Yes, ma'am?
Does that include our youth volunteers?
That includes your youth volunteers. Everybody under the age of 18, so if you're an adult working with youth, you need to have the 33, 34.
No. Does that include my youth who are helping with Bible school?
How old are they?
16.
No, they do not need it. Because they're not, you wouldn't be able to get anything from the record check anyways, so, yeah. Any other questions? So the next slide is the code. If you need the FBI record check, there are codes that you need to get it. And if you're, this is on the conference website on the Safe Sanctuary part, and then you can always shoot me an email, and I can give that to you. But we'll go to the next slide. These clearances are good for 5 years. Right, so every 5 years, you need to get a new clearance. Now, for volunteers, the good news is that these clearances are free. So you can get a new clearance, 33, 34, every 57 months, which is just right under 5 years, right under the 60-month line. And these clearances can be used for school, for Boy Scouts, for Girl Scouts, for after-school programs. You can use them across the board. If you are a teacher or some other professional that has 33, 34 as part of your church or out of your working world, you can use that for church. You cannot use a church, a volunteer, to do a professional work, right? They only go one direction. They can only go down. And like I said, they're free. The FBI one is never free. That will always cost money, and I think currently they're about, $23 to get an FBI clearance if you need to have one of those. Any other questions about the 2 adults in every classroom or the Pennsylvania clearances? Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So number 2, all doors to classrooms, offices, and supply closets should have windows in the doors, right? We want to have visibility and accountability, right? It allows that nervous parent to come and kind of peek in and make sure that everything is going okay with little Johnny or little Susie. But as an adult, as a volunteer, you also know that you have somebody that could be looking in on you. So it allows for accountability. Right? If we're doing something in church that we don't want anybody else to see, we probably shouldn't be doing it in church. Right? We don't mind accountability. This is not who we are. And so it says offices, supply closets. If you have a locked closet, like a chemical closet, a paper supply closet, limited access, it does not necessarily need a window. Now, I would say if there is room enough for you to step in that closet, then you should have a window. But if you open up the doors and you're looking at shelves and nobody can get in there, then I think you're safe not to have a window. If the boiler room usually has a door. I think that's a fire code. You want to check with your local fire department and see what the fire code is for the window in that kind of a door. Don't put windows in bathroom doors. That just is a whole different set of problems. You don't want to go down that road. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Yeah. It just, the windows just allow for accountability. It allows for visibility. And it's just, they provide safety. And so we'll go to the next slide. Number 3, no person in authority should be less than 18 years of age. And there should always be a 5-year gap between who is helping and who is being helped. I remember when my daughter Sophia was, 6 years old, and she really wanted to work in the nursery. And it's like, Sophia, you're not going to be any help. You are going to cause more problems in nursery than you're really going to be helping. One of my when I was up in St. Mary's in our vacation Bible school, it went up through 5th grade, and I tell you, I'll never forget the summer that I was doing the games, the recreation, and my helpers were 6th grade boys. Yeah, there's no difference between a 5th grade boy and a 6th grade boy. Like, all they wanted to do was play. It was not helpful. I can tell you horror stories of 19-year-old youth leaders and 18-year-old youth. Just put it all aside, right? If you've got a 19-year-old youth leader and an 18-year-old youth, and if he's 19 and she's 18, right, an 18-year-old female is about 30 years old mentally, and 19-year-old male is only about 12. So it's a very unequal relationship there. And you just don't want to go there. For youth group, right, you can have 19, 20, 21-year-olds helping. But you don't want to put them in a position where they don't have an older adult there to walk beside them. You want somebody with some age and experience to be there with them, right? Don't put them into bad and unsafe situations. So we go to the next slide. This is just a little bit more of what I was talking about, just guidelines as far as, when kids could help or should help. And, I think being a servant is a part of what it means to be a disciple. And so, my daughter's 16 now. Like, you want to help with nursery? Absolutely. That's awesome, right? That's part of who we are, right? We're servants. We imitate Jesus and be a servant. Now she's actually a lot of help. 10 years ago, not so much, but today, yes. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. For all activities or ministries with children, there should be a sign in and sign out sheet, right? You want to make sure that whoever is signing this child in is the same person picking up the child. Now, unfortunately, this is a very true story. I remember going to a church with Jan and Sophia, and we took Sophia to Sunday school. Their Sunday school ran concurrent with the church service, and so Sophia went to a Sunday school class, and Jan and I went to worship service. We went to go pick up Sophia after church, and they wanted to give us a different child. I mean, that's not a joke. I mean, it's and we can laugh about it now. It's a little funny. It's like, well, we've got a lot of years in on this model. We really like this one. Getting the kinks worked out on her, and but like I've been a part of the club for a long time. I grew up in the church. I'm a pastor now. I've got my union card, so it's like, I can laugh about that. But I put myself in a position of a young parent who maybe is coming into the church for the very first time, and they're bringing their baby, they're bringing their child, right? Their most treasured possession, and something like that happens. I don't know if they ever come back to church. And so knowing who the child is allowed to be picked up by is extremely important, right? So when you're signing a child in, whatever form it is, there are a couple necessary blocks that have to be a part of it, right? Who's dropping the child off? Jan Kindle. Name of the child, Sophia Kindle. It should be, Jan Kindle and her cell phone number, Sophia Kindle. Who is allowed to pick up Sophia Kindle? And, if my wife, if she forgets to put my name down, and I go to pick up my daughter from nursery or a Sunday school class, I should not be allowed to pick up my child because the person dropping them off did not put me down, right? Because that's why you capture the cell phone number, because one of two things is going to happen, right? Hey, Jan, this is, so-and-so from the nursery. Chris is here to pick up Sophia. Is it okay that he takes her? Oh, yeah, that's Dad. I forgot to put him down, no problem. Or you're going to hear, call 911. He's not allowed anywhere near her. The beginning of last year, there was a case of custodial kidnapping from a church, where a father went into a church where the mother had taken their child, little boy, and kidnapped him from the nursery area, the Sunday school area, because they did not follow the sign in and sign out sheet. Now, thankfully, that it all worked out. The little boy was found and reunited with the mother. But stories like that don't always end happily. And so again, we have to do our best to make sure we know who's picking up our children. And then the next slide, I forgot about this one, so you can have electronic buzzers, you can have those restaurant buzzers. There are iPad applications now that spit out stickers with special codes. Like whatever you do, you just make sure you know who's allowed to pick up the child, and you only release them to parents. Right? Every church I've ever been to has got 1 million doors. And so letting kids run free could be difficult, can be problematic. And so you allow the parents to pick up the children. And so the next slide is about youth, right? Youth, you want to go through a similar sign-in and sign-out process. It's wouldn't be the first time that, mom and dad dropped off Johnny and Johnny walked in the front door of the church, out the back door of the church, only to return 2 hours later. The sign-in, sign-out sheet allows us to know who we are responsible for. If there's a fire, you can grab information. These are all the kids that we have to account for. If Johnny breaks his leg during a mean game of Foursquare, now our church insurance can come to bear. because we have record of Johnny being at church. The next slide is about if you have a ministry with mentally handicapped adults, physically challenged adults. My home church has had a long history of this. And they're usually brought by somebody, they're brought by a helper. Well, everybody signs in, right? It simply allows us to know who we are responsible for, who has been a part of our ministry. Youth, you can have the youth sign in, or you can have the parents sign in. You want to make sure that somebody is signing in. I was doing this training one time at a church, and the pastor was younger. He was a newer pastor, and he shared a story of when he was in youth group. His youth group went on a weekend retreat, and because the youth pastor did not account for everybody that he was responsible for, Johnny and Susie spent the weekend in a hotel rather than going on the youth retreat. Imagine that conversation come Monday morning between some very angry parents and a very unemployed youth pastor because of what happened. So sign in, sign out sheets are good things. Yes, Tom.
Somebody like 2 or 3 years ago tried to pull that one off over here. A girl and a boy tried to get away with that one time that weren't signed up for something and told their parents they were. And I was like, "You're not signed up for this. You're not coming, and I want you to meet your grandma."
We got to pay attention. Got to pay attention. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Any questions on that so far that I've talked about? I'm just kind of blitzing through them. Yes, ma'am.
I have a quick question in regards to the statement you made that they should only be released to parents.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, and I work in the Sunday school setting with elementary children, sometimes in situations, siblings can come. Can you share a little bit about your recommendations for that? And secondly, sometimes parents will bring their children as some friends, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously that parent has given them permission to do that. So picking them up, if they drop them off and have that same code, then they can pick them up, I'm assuming. But hear that one.
Right. Yeah, so the second question, so if you're bringing guests, the adult just signs them in and then is the one who can sign them out. That's just, that would be the best practice. It is the best practice is to only allow adults to pick up children from Sunday school classes.
What if they're adult siblings?
If they're what?
Adult siblings.
Adult siblings, like over 18. If they're on the list as far as who can pick them up, I think that's fair game. It's Jan could be like Jan, Chris, and Evelyn, who happens to be like Sophia's adopted grandmother. Like as a parent, if I say that's cool, then that's cool.
24-year-old sister can be picked up by my 8-year-old can be picked up by his 24-year-old sister.
As long as you say that, yes, that would be absolutely acceptable. So you can alter it, right? Latrobe has, absolutely every right to say, well, we will allow older siblings, not 18 older, but, a couple of years older, we will allow older siblings to come and gather students. You just, again, recognize anytime you deviate from the best practices, you always increase risk. So, does that help?
It does. It's just, and again, we have a lot of things in place here.
Mm-hmm.
For positive experiences, but sometimes a parent will drop the child off and a sibling will pick the child up, and you're unaware of that. But Enos, is the person that Pastor Tom has directed to monitor that.
Mm-hmm.
And you know them, and I know what you're saying about Shelby, but sometimes you don't know whose home he may be going to. And I always worry
Mm-hmm.
They were being diligent, they would say that ahead of time,
Mm-hmm.
so the teacher knew that's what's going on.
Right. I mean, so I fully recognize that the scenarios I'm giving is like everybody in church doesn't know anybody else, right? So you come to church here, you know, we know who's coming to Sunday school. We know, we're aware of, you know, if there's custody issues and things like that. Those will get filtered through. And in small towns, small churches, we will come to know that. But what I'll say is that we don't do this for us. We do it for people who maybe yet aren't a part of church. And so we don't start keeping track of or doing a sign in and sign out when we have a new person. We do it on a weekly basis so that when we do have new people, we are automatically doing it. And we don't have to think about, oh, what do we need to, you know, what's the information I need to have? What do we need to, you know, get down? And, you know, I'm sure, you know, in my scenario, Jan at some point will simply write, you know, Jan, Sophia, C and J, and then walk off, because she's been there a ton of times. But, you know, again, I think, you know, when we think about hospitality, if you've got somebody new coming up and you say like, okay, well, you don't need to sign in, you don't need to sign in, you don't need to sign in. Oh, I don't know you. You have to sign in. It's not good hospitality. And it shows like, oh, I'm fearful of you. I don't know you. But we're supposed to be welcoming. And so that's why I just think, you know, whether you do it a little bit truncated, a little bit, you know, shorter, but just to make sure you're doing something every week to do that. Any other questions? Okay. So we'll talk about 6-month rule for new attenders. Yeah, don't speed up. What this best practice is, what it's saying is that somebody who's working with children, youth, or vulnerable adults must be a part of the church for at least 6 months before doing that, right? It makes sure that we know who is working with these populations. Now, we're not saying that if somebody, you know, comes to church for the very first time, we're not saying they can't come to Bible study. They can't come, you know, do the food kitchen or food service. They, you know, can't do these types of things. All we simply say is, you know, for 6 months, we want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us. You know, find where you fit into the life of our church together. And what this does is that it slows things down. Right, so, you know, over the last, 20-some years as a pastor, there have been a handful of times where, you know, church is over and I'm standing here and I'm greeting people as they come up and I'm talking with them. And, you know, it's always a weird thing when somebody comes up on a Sunday morning, you've never met them, say, hey, this is great. You know, my church, I've worked with youth. I want to come and work with, I want to come and volunteer with the youth group tonight. Right? And it's like, oh, well, you think, volunteer, this is great. Well, excuse me, not really good. Not in this situation, right? So I'd go into my speech and say, well, you know, our church has a policy where we ask people to be a part of the church for at least 6 months before they start volunteering with the youth. And I've shared that a lot of times. And most of the time, people receive it very well because they understand what I'm saying. Not saying anything is wrong with them. It's just, this is our church policy. You know, we want to give you this gift of simply being able to come to church without you feeling like you have to give. There have been a couple times, however, when I've shared that I never saw the person ever again. They stomped off in a huff and they left. You know, predators don't want to have to wait. You know, they're just like everybody else. They want what they want and they want it now. And predators have to go through what's called a grooming process, and it's a time-consuming process where they build up a trust with their potential victims, and they don't want to have to wait 6 months to do that. You know, and the goal isn't to get them to go down to the street to the Presbyterian church or the Catholic church or the Lutheran church. You know, peripherally they're doing exactly what we're doing, talking about how we care for and protect our children, youth, and vulnerable adults. This is simply slowing things down. It's like a dating process. We get to date them, they get to date us, we get to see where they fit. They get to see where they fit. And if they, eventually comes where they're working with youth, praise God, that's awesome. But maybe they find that, no, that maybe they're not suited for youth. They're better in this category instead of that one. So it just allows us to know who it is that we are working with. And so that next slide that we have is, just a little caveat that I always like to say that, because of church attendance these days, most people, when asked, they'll say if they go to church twice a month, they're regular church attenders. And there was a study that was done a couple of years ago before the pandemic that said if about 40% of the people said if they attended church once a month, they considered themselves a regular church attender. If somebody is not going to come to my church 6 times and have access to my kids, I want to know who's working with my youth. I want to know who has access to my children. And so that's 6 months, if they come 6 times, it's going, in my eyes, in my church, it's going to be extended. Because I'd rather fall on the side of protecting my children than being a little bit too loosey-goosey. So we'll go to the next slide. Next one is reference and background checks for volunteers and employees. So for people we don't know when they come to the church, we want to capture information about them, who they are, where do they live, what are their phone numbers, where do they work, things like that. But next slide, definitely when we have somebody who wants to work with us, we do application and references, criminal background checks as required by law, and we do safe sanctuary training, which would be really for everybody. And so on the next slide there, the difference between being a paid staff and a volunteer staff, a volunteer, is that paid staff have to have all 3 clearances, right? So volunteers only need the 3334. Paid staff need to have 3334 and the FBI. And again, they're good for 5 years, just like everybody else. They're not free. If you are paid staff, then you have to pay for the 3334 and the FBI record check. A question that is asked often is, well, what about our church secretary? And the way the law is worded, it says that anybody who with or who has access to children shall have. And so, the church, the church secretary doesn't work with children, but has access to children. And so as a conference, we've chosen to say that church secretary should have all 3 clearances. And a custodian doesn't work with children, but a custodian would have access to children. And so we've taken the stance to say that we believe that the custodian should have all 3 clearances. And the question comes with, well, what about that part-time church treasurer who works off-site? Well, doesn't work with children and doesn't really have access to children because they're working from home. But a good rule of thumb to me is that anybody who is paid should get all 3. It just cleans things up. Now I'll say something about the clearances. You will see things on clearances, right? Because that scripture from Romans, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Some of us have been caught. And so those clearances, you will see things. Like you'll see drunk driving, that's a big one. Drugs is getting larger now. Breaking and entering, burglary, things like that. Those don't necessarily mean that someone can't help with children or youth, right? If you have somebody who's been a part of the church for 20 years, they turn in their clearances, and you see a drunk driving arrest from 20 years ago. Nothing since. I don't have a big problem in allowing that person to be a part of the youth group, be a youth leader. You might see one from 5 years ago. If you know that person and you feel comfortable with it, They could be a youth leader. You may not want to have them as a driver, but they could be a part of the youth. So there's nothing in Pennsylvania Crime Code that says if you have committed this, then you can't do something like this in church. There are things like if you want to be a dealer at a casino, if you committed this crime, you can never do it. There are things that exist like that in the PA Crime Code, but not for working with children. If you have anything on your child line, you can't work with kids, right? You want to make sure that that is a hard and fast rule. You don't work with kids. And so, over the years, sometimes people have a hesitancy to fill these clearances out because of something they've done in the past. And so that becomes a, pastoral counseling type of issue, and we work through that, These clearances are held in confidence, right? They're not for everybody to see. They're on the premises here, they're under lock and key. You have maybe a small committee of 2 or 3 people who would see these, and if they need to be approved, something like that. So the other hesitancy too, I've learned about filling out the clearances is that sometimes previous victims don't like to fill these out because of the way things are reported. Sometimes those things can come up as well. And so I don't fully understand it. It's what a police chief had told me during one of my trainings. And so I just try to pay attention to those types of things. So we talk to our folks. It breaks my heart when I have, people in my church. And I remember the first time I was at Concord, there's this one guy who, I know very well and love him. And now this is early on in Safe Sanctuary years, but just like as a matter of principle, he wouldn't do the clearances. And it's a shame because then he can't work with children or youth. And he would be a blessing. But if you don't fill out the clearances, you can't do it. And so just, kind of important. So we'll go ahead. Go ahead. That's just those clearances, the codes again. So, all right. So hopefully you're getting an understanding of why Safe Sanctuaries works, right? Because it's not clearances. Clearances alone don't keep us safe. And 2 adults in every classroom don't keep us safe. And windows in the doors don't keep us safe. And that developmental age gaps don't keep us safe. And the 6-month hospitality rule doesn't keep us safe. It's all of the layers together is what keeps us safe as a church, right? And so everything we've been talking about so far has been very defensive. And the 7th part, or the 7th piece, is our offensive weapon, right? Understanding who has to report and why. So Pennsylvania did not do a lot with their crime or their child protection laws for many years, but they started ramping things up 2013, 2014, 2015, because Penn State happened. And the big thing with Penn State was everybody who was involved said, I told somebody, and I told somebody, but nobody ever told the police. And so Pennsylvania has made it very clear that if you witness abuse, if you suspect abuse, or if you've been told about abuse, and part of the told is also if somebody 14 years of age or older discloses to you that they've committed abuse, that you have to report it. Okay? So we'll go a slide, go another slide, go another slide. This one. So in 2014, right, mandated reporter law, it states that every clergy person is considered a mandated reporter. And so if you're a pastor, you are a mandated reporter for everybody in your church, everybody under the age of 18. And we'll go to the next slide. Mandated, the CPSL goes on to say, any individual paid or unpaid who works on the basis of their role as a part of a regularly scheduled program, activity, or service accepts responsibility for a child is also considered a mandated reporter. So to break this down, what this slide is saying, which is just copied straight from the Pennsylvania Crime Code, is that, say, if you are a first and second grade Sunday school teacher, right, you are accepting responsibility for first and second grade Sunday school kids. You are a mandated reporter for first and second grade Sunday school. You are not a mandated reporter for third and fourth because you have not accepted responsibility for them, right? First and second, you're their teacher, you've accepted responsibility for them. All this means is that you cannot be held legally responsible if you witness, suspect, or are told about abuse in third or fourth grade, right? I would argue that we probably have a moral, biblical, ethical mandate that if we see something, we should report it. We just cannot be held responsible if it's in a group that we are not accepting responsibility for. So we'll go to the next slide. So if you witness, suspect, or are told about abuse, you have to call Pennsylvania Child Line. And it's you, not your pastor. In fact, once you tell your pastor, then your pastor is a secondary reporter and has to make a phone call as well. But it'll be a shorter phone call. Your pastor, I know Chris. If you tell Chris, he'll sit right next to you as you make your phone call. He wants to know that this is going on. He cannot tell you to not call, right? It's not his responsibility, but he will be there beside you to support you. And Tom would be doing the same thing if it's a part of the youth. So whoever sees it, whoever suspects it, whoever is told is the one that has to make the phone call. So when you call this number, it is anonymous up until a point. Once it's determined that this is a reportable offense, then you need to share all of your information because children and youth are going to want to be able to get in contact with you. If they say it's not something that needs to be reported, then you just hang up your phone, you go your merry way, and nothing's going to happen. Now, if you call Child Line and you make this report and you're wrong, nothing can happen to you. Right? Written into the law is this good faith statement that if you make a phone call because you really think this, nothing at all is going to be happening to you. You cannot be sued. Right? Nothing is going to go wrong. Now, if you call Child Line because your brother and sister-in-law are getting a divorce and you want your brother to get a better child custody arrangement, you're in a lot of trouble because you've knowingly lied to a government agency and there's no protection for you. So, first thing you do, call Child Line. What a lot of CYS folks have told me over the years is they say, yes, that's the law, but as soon as you hang up the phone, call your local CYS. You're not doing anything wrong, you're just simply speeding up the process. Now, unfortunately, over the last couple years, a lot of CYSs are getting rid of their intake units, and so that is no longer possible. I don't know if that's true in this area or not, so I would still try to call CYS. You're just speeding up the process is all you're doing by calling them. Now, if you are at a youth group event, VBS event, and there is a child who maybe discloses that they've been abused, or somebody comes and they're visibly intoxicated or high, right? You cannot withhold a child from a legal parent or guardian. That is called kidnapping, and you can get in trouble for it. If that's the case, you stall and you have somebody call 911 because the police will come and they will take possession of the child and get CYS involved very quickly, quicker than any of us ever could. And then I would just simply close the loop by calling Child Line as well. One of the things you have to do when you call Childline, they're going to ask you to go online and fill out a CY47, it's called. It is an exhaustive list of questions, a questionnaire. You're not going to fill all of it out. Like one of the questions is, what's the victim's social security number, right? Unless it's mine, I don't know any other social security numbers. I'd have to call my wife, where's Sophia's social security card? I don't know where it's at. So if you can't answer it, you just leave it blank. So now, if I were to make a bet, and I won't because I'm a good Methodist, but if I was, I would place all the money I've got on this bet, that none of us woke up this morning saying, gosh, today's the day I hope I get to call Childline. Right? Did I win? Yeah. Nobody wants to. Nobody dreams of doing that. But again, remember what we're called to be. Remember what we're called to do. That God has placed us in a position to stand in front of these children. God could have placed you at that very moment to stop an abuse that may have been going on for years. That God wants you to imitate him and stand in front and say, this is not going to happen anymore. And so I know none of us want to do it, but again, you think about that child that you love the most, and you would do it for them. And so let's do it for any of them. If you're not sure, that's okay. You don't have to be Scooby-Doo, right? You don't have to have everything figured out. Allow COIS to do their job. They're going to do it, and they're going to do it well, and something will happen. So the other thing, too, when you call Childline, and we always think it's, something big and awful and terrible. And, any kind of child abuse is really awful. But, CYS's goal is not to take children away from homes. That is not a goal. And their stated goal is to reunite families, sometimes a little bit too much. But, when you call Childline, say you're calling because you see Johnny who comes to church and he's wearing just jeans and a t-shirt all year long. And you say, Johnny, where's your coat? No, I don't have one. And, well, why don't you have one? So you call Childline because it's neglect. It could be his parents are really struggling. And it's not they're doing it out of terribleness, but maybe they don't know a different way. And so by calling Childline, they're going to get involved with children and youth. Children and youth have access to medical care, to dental care, to clothing, to all sorts of things. And so by calling this number, you might be changing a family's life for the better. Right? It isn't just about taking a child away from parents, but it could be really drastically changing a child's life and a family's life forever. So any questions about that? That is an extremely brief description about mandated reporting. On your handouts is a web address for the conference website. On our conference website, Safe Sanctuaries WPAUMC /Safe Sanctuaries. We have on our website a link to a free 3-hour training that the University of Pittsburgh puts on, all about mandated reporting. And so if you're interested, yeah.
We've had to do that already.
Okay.
So I could sub an hour a day during band camp
Wow.
as a volunteer.
Well, thank you for doing that. It's timed. You cannot speed through it. It's
And they could summarize that whole 3 hours in 5 minutes.
right. Yeah, it's but for those people who want to learn more, there is a way that you could learn more. Any questions about mandated reporting? What you need to remember is, right, if you witness, suspect, or are told about abuse, you call Childline. You give them all the information, and then you pray. You know, but by doing that, you could be standing up for a child. We had a state trainer at the conference center came in and do a big day-long training about mandated reporting. And, you know, the stories that he would tell about, you know, kids who die in plain sight, people walking past them all the time, is just, it's heartbreaking. One thing I'll say, too, about mandated reporters, you know, there is right, so the rule is you have to accept responsibility to be considered a mandated reporter. Now, there are mandated reporters in our world today who are mandated reporters 24/7. And if you're wondering if that's you, it's not. Those people know exactly who they are, right? They work for CYS. You know, children and youth people are mandated reporters 24/7. If they see something at Walmart, they have to report it, right? You do not have to. You can, but you are not legally responsible to, right? So there are people in our world who are mandated reporters 24/7, and the vast majority of us are not. And if we wonder about that, we're not, because they know they are. Yes, Tom.
Can you say something about, not abuse, but like self-harm or suicide? Is that exactly the same or is it different?
It wouldn't fall under abuse, but they would. I'm sure Childline could give you some help with that. You know, there are others. 811, I think, is the new national suicide prevention hotline. That would be more of, you know, I would go that direction.
Well, I guess what I meant was as far as being mandated to report things here all the time. Well, so-and-so said. I heard it today at school.
Yeah, it really doesn't fall under mandated reporting because of abuse. But definitely if I saw a youth with cutting, I wouldn't naturally assume that it was the youth doing it. I would call Childline and have that followed up. Well, that's a good question, Tom. I don't think I've ever been asked that one. I'll have to look into that a little bit more. Yes?
I was just gonna say, CYS does have the intake system still in our area, so you could call them too.
They still have the intake? Cool. Yeah. There's a number for elder abuse as well. I'm in the process of redoing the training. I'm going to be adding some things to it, but you just Google Pennsylvania elder abuse, and it gives you that information as well. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. It's not about abuse or anything, but it's like to protect the volunteers. Should the parents let the volunteers know if their child has a special need? Like if they have a child that is Asperger's or autistic? Because some people might not be able to handle children like that.
You know, it probably makes some good sense. You know, your program, you might have something at the beginning of the year where you fill out a health card. If you have snacks, you want to make sure that, you know, I mean, if you have peanut allergies, you want to make sure you have a peanut-free policy, just things like that. Yeah, communication is always awesome. I mean, the more clarity we can get about a situation, the better. Okay, well, we'll move forward. Some travel issues. Oh, so you guys have a van, right? You're one of the few. There aren't too many of you all left that still have a church-owned vehicle, right? So you want to make sure you do screening and training of drivers. Do you know what the minimum age is for your driving? I heard 21, 20. What is it? 25, yeah. I always tell people I will guarantee you it's not 16. You know, That is for sure. So, and I've seen 21, 23, and 25 are the three most often ages for any kind of driving. So, and every policy is different, you know. 2 adult rule. So when you are transporting youth or children, it's primarily youth that we transport, you want to make sure you have 2 adults in a vehicle. Because if you are taking home 6 youth at the end of a youth night, it's eventually going to be you and a youth, and that is an unsafe situation. And so, you know, ideally, 2 unrelated adults. You know, I'll be the first to admit, there are many times I've grabbed my wife at the end of youth group and said, hey, you know, I've got to run these kids home, will you go with me? It's safer to be with Jan. It's not the best, but I'd still rather be with her than to be by myself. You know, some high school student, not high school students, what some high school teachers have told me over the years is that teenage victims of abuse have a lot of difficulty pointing to who's actually doing the abuse. Because oftentimes, you know, abusers we know. The stranger danger thing doesn't happen very often. We usually tend to know our abusers. And so it becomes very difficult for especially a teenager to say, this is the person that's doing it, because they're probably related to them. And so instead of saying this person, they'll say that person, because that person's safe. And that person who's safe could be a youth pastor or a pastor or a youth leader, right? And they don't do it because they're being malicious. They're doing it because they hope it eventually gets to the truth of the person who's really doing the abusing. You know, I want to be safe, and I want my youth to come to me, but I also am not going to put myself in a position where I get falsely accused, right? Because an accusation does not need to be true to ruin a life. And so you build those relationships, but you make sure that, you know, you don't put yourself in bad situations. And so 2 adults in every vehicle is just one of those things. It's, you know, it's a good rule to have. And then to keep good passenger records. Next slide. You know, so the 2 adult rule in a vehicle would be a caravan. Say if you're going someplace en masse, you're going on a mission trip, and you've got 3 or 4 vehicles. Well, you only need 1 adult in each vehicle because you're traveling together. So that is the exception. You know, youth driving other youth for youth group, right? Youth driving, your insurance company will have kittens if you allow youth to drive for youth events, right? That is not to happen. And as being a parent of, you know, a 16-year-old who is learning how to drive, that should not happen, right? You know, it's, you do not want youth driving youth. Youth driving themselves, if mom and dad say to Johnny, yes, Chris?
Back up to the youth driving other youth.
Yeah.
What are the ages, and how do you handle it if parent A says, hey, it's okay for my kid to ride with the kid of parent B, and parent B says, yeah, it's okay for my kid to all this?
It's exactly what I was answering right now. That's right. It's just great minds think alike, right? And so do ours. So, you know, if mom and dad say to Johnny that Johnny can drive to church, it's a contract between parent and child, and we don't have anything to say about it. And mom and dad say to Johnny can drive his younger siblings to church. It's a contract between parent and children, and we don't have anything to say about it. If mom and dad say to Johnny, you can drive Sophia to church, and Sophia's parents are, I don't say Sophia, Susie's parents are okay with that, then it's a contract between parent and children, and so we don't have anything to say about it. But I always like to joke, you know, as a father of a Sophia, there will be no Johnny driving her to church anytime soon. And so, Chris, you know, if a parent says that, you know, these 2 kids can go to church together, we don't have anything to say about it. Now, when that changes is when they come in contact with us. So once they come to church, they don't drive, right? They drive to church and they drive home. That's it. And so if we're doing something off-site, say if we're doing a hayride, you know, Johnny can either drive to church and get taken, or Johnny can drive straight to the hayride, because once he comes in contact with us, he no longer is a driver, because youth do not drive for youth events. But if mom and dad say he can drive to the hayride, he can drive straight to the hayride. So hopefully does that give you a little bit of clarity on that? A little bit or a lot? Oh, okay.
Once they're here, they're out.
Right. hmm And so they don't drive anymore. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. Oh, go back one. So this is something I shouldn't have to say, but it's happened, and so I feel like I need to say it. Never put a youth in a trunk so that you're not alone with them in a car. This has come up. What's that? Roof rack. That's not good either. There was somebody in licensing school a couple years ago that bragged about, I've never been alone in the youth with a car, and when I've been there, I make them get into the trunk. And right, they were going to be a pastor. They were on track to become a pastor. They're no longer on track to be a pastor, so that's a good thing. But that would be something you might call child line about, right? They put my child in a trunk. That is child abuse. So. Yeah, we're not sneaking into movie theaters anymore. So, okay, we can go forward now. Something else I shouldn't have to say, but I will. Never share a bed with a child. You think about what a modern hotel unit looks like. We have 2 queen beds, and do we put an adult and a youth and 2 youth in one bed? That's a horrible idea. Don't do it. But 1 adult in a bed and 2 youth in a bed? It's a horrible idea. Don't do it. Do we put 1 adult in this bed and 1 youth in this bed? It's a horrible idea. Don't do it. So if you're dealing with hotel rooms, right, you've got boy rooms over here. You've got girl rooms way down at this end of the hall. And then you've got the chaperones in between. Right? So boy rooms, girl rooms, chaperone rooms. And that's how we keep the rooms separate. Never be alone in a room with a child. One thing, I've said this off and on in different types of trainings, but, sharing a bed with a child, I'll go on to say, like, even if it's your own, don't share a bed even with your own child. And I just allow your child to have the experience. So when a couple years ago, we went to Zimbabwe. We took a bunch of youth to there. It was a first youth trip that we took to that country, and we made a decision very early on that no parents were allowed to go, because we knew of a parent that really wanted to go, and we said this is not going to be good, and so we made that rule really quick. And this parent really fought us on it hard because they wanted to go, and when we went, it was an incredible experience. These youth that went just opened up, and it was a great experience. And we came home, and we were videoing the students, and this particular parent was asking questions. And when the parents' teen was being questioned, the teen would answer like, nothing. And so the person who was doing the videoing said, hey, why don't you step out for a second and let me ask the questions? And so the parent left the room, and then the videographer started asking questions, and this teen just started talking nonstop. Parents, we can unknowingly take away from the experience. I think why these mission trips are so powerful for youth is because they mimic the spiritual disciplines, the discipline of silence and solitude, right? It pulls us up out of our normal and our ordinary, and it places us in a position where God can really speak to us. That's why these things are so important. And as a parent, we can short circuit that when we're there. And so that's I always say, just give your child that space to be where God wants them to be so that they might hear. And I say that as a helicopter parent. Like if Sophia said, Dad, I want to go to Zimbabwe, it's going to kill me to not go. I'll be gray or bald as she leaves. But I know if I go, I'm going to screw up that trip for her because she needs to experience that. She and Jesus, not she, Dad, and Jesus. Jesus will be there with her, and she'll get something far greater than if I was there. I don't like it, but it's true. So always, never share a bed with a child. Don't be alone in a room with a child. Adults must be of the same gender as the students they're chaperoning, right? So as soon as you have two genders of students, you have two genders of chaperones. If it's a boy trip, you got male chaperones, male students, no problem. The girls trip, female chaperones, female students, no problem. As soon as you got more than one of each, you have to have male and female chaperones. Next slide. Adults should never be alone in a room with one child. So I ahead. But yeah, so everything I just said, we'll go with this slide right there, right? Don't be alone in a room with one child. Doors should always open up to the hallway. Some of those hotel rooms have the doors that connect hotel rooms. And so if you've got a youth room and an adult room, it can be an unsafe situation. And if you have two boy rooms connected, something will get broken, you'll have to pay for it. So you just stay away from that. And adjacent rooms are best, right? Don't have your students on the 7th floor and your adults on the 3rd floor. Shenanigans will ensue and nothing will be good. So you want to stay connected and together. Whenever you entrust your students to us as a conference, like at annual conference at Spark, we always have night walkers who walk the hotel and make sure, two unrelated adults, they will walk all the hallways and make sure that Johnny and Susie stay in their respective rooms all night long. So go to the next slide. Cabin settings are a little bit different, right? And so the camp that I'm most familiar with, the camp I grew up at, was Wesley Woods. And so when you go to Wesley Woods, you come in, there's this great big common area, and then you have bunk rooms. So you got 18 bunk beds really on either side of the room. And so you put one chaperone at this exit door, you put one chaperone at that exit door, and you just allow the youth to fill in. You got a boy side and a girl side. And that's how we take care of our cabins. So next slide. Potty policy. So if your church is still doing diapering, right? Diapering is one of those practices in nurseries that are going the way of the dodo. They're becoming less and less popular. Less and less churches are still doing them. But if you are going to be doing diapering, you want to make sure you're doing it in an open, visible area, right? You want to make sure that you can be seen. I'm not saying do it in the middle of a hallway. Right? We want to preserve the privacy of the child, but you do not want to be in some alcove where nobody can see you. And so the other adult in that room needs to be able to see what you're doing as you're doing that diapering. Always allow for supervised independence, right? Let the children ask for help. Don't insert yourself into that situation. Always allow for complete privacy. Unless it's an emergency, get the parents first, right? They're the ones that made them. Let them be the ones to clean up after them. And always check bathrooms, depending on the time of year, especially vacation Bible school time. All the doors to the church are open, so just take a peek in the bathroom. Make sure that's a safe place for the kids to go into before anything happens. And we'll go next. Some things, never counsel the opposite sex behind closed doors. Never counsel anybody behind closed doors. Sanctuaries are a great place to have good, deep conversations, especially with youth, because you could have a conversation right up here and have somebody sitting in the back. It would be a completely private conversation, but it would be completely visible. So this would be a very safe place to have a very important, deep conversation. And never visit children or youth home alone, right? Don't insert yourself into an unsafe situation. And then, last thing I'll say is watch your dress, your language, your alcohol, tobacco, and firearm activities. Youth group is not a time for a spirited discussion about the Second Amendment. Youth group is about Jesus, and so we want to keep it about Jesus. One other thing I'll talk about, social media and cell phones. Follow the 2-adult rule when you're dealing with social media. You should never text a youth by yourself. Any texting you do always includes somebody else. Ideally it includes a parent, but if not, another one of the adult leaders, right? So it's never a one-on-one conversation. You're always looping somebody else in. Stay away from Snapchat. That's the devil's playground. Everything on Snapchat's designed to disappear forever. And so keep all of your texts. And that is impossible with Snapchat. So that's why we stay away from it. All right. I think that's it, right? Yeah, questions, answers. Any questions on anything I might have said poorly or not explained well? Any kind of questions for me tonight? I don't believe I did that good a job for there to be no questions. I've heard me talk before. All right. Well, if you do have any questions, all of my information is on the handout. Feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, and I would be happy to talk with you about anything. And Tom has a certificate of completion for you as well tonight. So thank you so much for inviting me, allowing me to come and talk with you guys. And if you'll permit me, let us pray together. Gracious God, thank you for being here with us tonight. And Lord, as we have talked about something that I know is near and dear to your heart, Lord, as we seek to care for and protect the most vulnerable in our midst, Lord, we pray that we would do so with the best of our abilities. Lord, bless this church, bless its ministries, and thank you, Jesus, for loving us, and we love you back. It's in your name we pray. Amen.